Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Snow lay thick across the ground that morning, the kind that muffled every sound and made the world feel smaller. And Gideon Hale felt the familiar tight pull in his injured leg as he stepped out of his cabin. The air stung his face while he adjusted the wool coat around his shoulders, breathing out a slow cloud that drifted away before disappearing. He scanned the quiet yard the way he always did, checking the barn roof, the fence line, and the trees beyond the path, because old habits never left him, no matter how many winters had passed since the war. He walked toward the creek with a steady, practiced pace. The sun had barely risen, leaving most of the forest in a pale blue light. Gideon's limp was more obvious today. The cold pushed into the old bullet wound and tightened the muscle around it. He pressed his gloved hand against his thigh for a moment, steadying himself before continuing down the narrow slope. The creek's water ran under a thin layer of ice, the current visible in the soft shift of dark shapes beneath. Gideon started to kneel to check the trap he had set the night before, but a shape farther down the bank pulled his attention away. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a log. It was a human body lying half covered in snow. His pulse jumped once in a sharp, controlled beat. He didn't rush toward her. He made himself scan the trees first, turning slightly to make sure no one else waited nearby. Only wind moved through the branches. He approached slowly, step after step, until he was close enough to see she was a young woman. Apache from her clothing, her long black hair, the beaded leather still visible beneath the frost. Her skin had lost much of its color. Her lips were cracked. Her wrists were red and swollen, the skin scraped as if rope had torn into it for days. Gideon crouched beside her with a grunt of effort. His heart hitched for a moment, not from panic, but from something heavier, something like the memory of too many broken bodies he'd found after battles long ago. He pushed the memory down and focused on her breathing. It was faint, uneven. She was alive, but only barely. He touched her shoulder. "Can you hear me?" No response. Her eyelids twitched at the movement, but she didn't open them. Her body trembled once, a sharp, involuntary shake caused by cold more than fear. Gideon felt a knot of urgency climb up his spine. If he left her here to fetch help, she wouldn't last an hour, and there was no one else around. He was the only person within miles. He slid his arms beneath her, adjusting his grip until he could support her head and back. Her weight pressed against him in an uneven slump, and he felt her ribs shift with the effort of breathing. She was lighter than she should have been. Starvation, cold, or both. As he stood, his leg throbbed hard enough to make him grit his teeth. He tightened his jaw but kept moving, lifting her carefully so her head wouldn't hang. He didn't know her name or what had been done to her, but leaving her wasn't something he could do. Not anymore. Not after the war. Not after losing too many people because he acted too late. Snow broke under his boots in a slow, heavy rhythm as he carried her up the slope. Her hair brushed against his coat, stiff with ice. She made a faint sound, something like a breath hitting pain, but never opened her eyes. Gideon shifted her slightly, tucking her closer to shield her from the wind. By the time he reached the cabin, sweat had formed at the back of his neck despite the cold. He kicked the door open with his heel and stepped inside, closing it with a solid thud. Warmth from the stove hadn't reached the far edges of the room yet, but it was enough to keep a person alive. He set her gently on the bed, lowering her until her head rested on the old pillow. Her fingers curled weakly. One of them brushed his coat sleeve, and he froze for a second, wondering if she was waking. But her hand dropped again, limp. Gideon moved quickly. He fed more wood into the stove until the flames rose higher. He filled a small basin with warm water and set it near the bed. He lifted the quilt and pulled it over her slowly, watching how her body reacted. When warmth touched her skin, she shivered hard, a painful, uncontrolled reaction, then eased back into stillness. He sat down in the single chair across the room and watched her for a moment, letting the tension in his shoulders sink. His heartbeat steadied. He listened to the faint crackle of fire, the subtle rasp of her breathing, and the silence between them. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who had hurt her or if someone would come searching. But the sight of her lying half dead by the creek had hit something in him he couldn't ignore. He leaned back slightly, rubbing the stiff muscle in his leg. "You're safe here," he muttered under his breath, even though she couldn't hear him. He stayed seated, sharpening his knife in slow, careful strokes while keeping her in the corner of his vision. She didn't move again, but her breathing, though fragile, kept going. For the first time in months, Gideon didn't feel completely alone, and that feeling unsettled him more than he expected. Late morning light entered the cabin in thin stripes through the small window, warming only the spot where it touched. The rest of the room held a steady chill, the kind that lingered even with the stove burning. Gideon Hale sat on the floor beside the wood box, sorting through dry pieces he had set aside the night before, when he heard a shift behind him, a blanket rustling, a sharp intake of breath, the subtle sound of someone waking from a place of pain. He turned his head slowly so she wouldn't startle. The Apache woman was awake. Her body stayed stiff under the quilt, shoulders raised, breath caught halfway between a gasp and a warning. Her dark eyes scanned the ceiling, the walls, the corners of the room in quick, sharp movements before they locked on him. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She stared as if assessing whether she had woken in danger. Gideon stayed seated. He rested both hands on his knees, letting her see he wasn't reaching for anything. "You're inside my cabin," he said quietly. "Found you by the creek yesterday." Her gaze flicked to the door immediately, as if measuring distance, speed, and the condition of her legs. Gideon saw it all in one glance. The instinct to run, the distrust formed from too many hands that hadn't helped her in the past. "You're safe here," he added, not soft, not forceful, just steady. She didn't relax. Her fingers tightened in the blanket, knuckles white from strain. Her breathing grew uneven, catching each time she recognized an object in the room. A chair, a rifle leaning against the wall, boots by the door. Her eyes lingered on the rifle longer than anything else. Gideon reached toward the stove, but he moved slowly, giving her time to see his intentions. He adjusted the kettle so the water would stay warm, then stood up with deliberate steadiness. "There's water there," he said, nodding to the small bowl on the table beside her. "Warm enough." She looked at it, but didn't touch it right away. Her attention swung back to him, narrowing slightly as she studied his face, then his hands, searching for danger. Gideon understood the look. He had seen it in soldiers who woke after ambushes, in civilians who survived raids, people who expected the next moment to hurt. He stepped back, giving her space. "Drink when you're ready." For a long moment, neither moved. Then she lifted her upper body slowly, careful to keep the quilt between them like a shield. She reached for the bowl, her fingers trembling. When the warm water touched her lips, her eyes closed briefly, not in relief, but in shock at having warmth instead of cold. She drank in small sips, her throat working visibly. She stopped halfway through, as if afraid to finish it all and be left with nothing. Gideon saw the calculation in her eyes. "Save half. Stay ready. Don't trust what you can't predict." He pulled his coat on, walked to the front door, and unlatched it. Cold air rushed inside as he stepped out. He left the door slightly open, an intentional choice. If she wanted to run, he wasn't going to trap her. Outside, the snow softened under the warming sun, melting in small patches around the yard. Gideon walked toward the woodpile, grabbing the axe with practiced ease. Each swing came with a dull thump and a grunt from his leg as the strain hit the old wound. Inside, she watched him. He didn't look at her directly, but he caught her presence through the slight shadow in the doorway. She had moved to the edge of the bed, still wrapped in the quilt, studying him from behind the partially open door. Her eyes followed his every step, tracking his movement with guarded tension. Not trust, not yet, but a shift from fear to awareness. When he came back inside, carrying an armful of chopped wood, she didn't retreat. She stayed on the bed, rigid but unflinching, eyes lowered only when he passed near her. "Put more wood in," he said, nodding to the stove. "Keeps the cold off." She didn't respond, but her gaze flicked to the flames, then back to him, as if deciding whether this place was safer than the wilderness behind her. Gideon set the wood down, wiped his gloves on his pants, and checked her face again. Her cheeks had warmed slightly. Her lips held color now. The frostbitten look had eased. "You need food soon," he said, keeping his tone matter of fact. Her back straightened, the reaction quick and sharp, a sign of fear or memory. He couldn't tell. He held up a hand to show he wasn't stepping closer. "Just saying," he murmured. The room fell quiet again, except for the faint pop of the fire and the muffled sound of melting snow dripping from the roof. Noya. He didn't know her name yet, but her presence felt solid, like she had weight in this space now. Lowered her gaze and rested one hand on her thigh. Her fingers twitched, then steadied. She was fighting the urge to flee. Gideon could see that clearly, but she stayed seated. She stayed. That choice, small as it was, struck something deep in him, something old and rarely touched. He nodded once, not approval, not expectation, just acknowledgement, and went to wash his hands in the basin. Behind him, she breathed out slowly, the kind of exhale a person makes only when they believe, for the moment, they might survive the next few hours. By the next morning, a thick gray sky pressed low over the land, promising more snow. Gideon Hale stepped outside before sunrise, rubbing the stiffness from his leg as he moved toward the barn with slow, steady steps. The cold bit at his jaw, but he kept going, pushing open the barn door to check on the hay stores and the mule that relied on him to stay alive through winter. Inside the cabin, the Apache woman woke to the muted creak of the door closing behind him. She stayed still beneath the quilt, listening. Her eyes scanned the room again: bed, stove, table, chair, rifle by the wall. It all looked the same as yesterday, but her breathing came easier this time. The warmth helped. The quiet helped too. When the stove crackled low, she pushed the blanket aside and stood with slow, cautious movements. The cold-wood floor sent a shock up her legs, and she steadied herself against the bedpost. Her wrists ached from old wounds. Her ribs tugged sharply when she reached for the kettle, a reminder of hands that had grabbed her too hard and too often. She pushed the memory down, straightening her back. She poured warm water from the kettle into a tin cup, testing the heat with her finger before drinking. The warmth spread through her chest, loosening the tight clamp around her lungs. She moved slowly around the cabin, staying close to the walls, testing each step as if expecting a trap that never came. When she heard boots approaching, her shoulders tensed sharply. Her fingers curled into the edge of the table. But Gideon entered without urgency. He hung his coat on the nail, brushed snow from his shoulders, and only looked at her once to confirm she was awake and standing before moving to the sink basin to wash his hands. He didn't act surprised. He didn't ask her why she was out of bed. "You cold?" he asked, keeping his voice even. She didn't answer with words. She simply pulled the wool cloak he'd left out tighter around her shoulders. Gideon nodded slightly, accepting that answer, and reached into a cabinet for a small pot. He filled it with broth and set it on the stove. He didn't turn his back to her too long. He didn't step too close. He gave her the distance she needed. When the broth warmed, he ladled it into a tin bowl and placed it on the table, then stepped away so she could approach on her own terms. She hesitated, glancing at him for a brief second. Her eyes held suspicion, fatigue, and a faint glimmer of something he recognized: hunger mixed with caution. Then she approached the bowl, lifting it with both hands to keep it from trembling. The steam fogged her lashes, but she didn't blink it away. She sipped slowly, every swallow careful, her throat working harder than it should. Gideon sat on the edge of his chair and began mending a broken mule harness, threading old leather through metal rings. He didn't watch her directly, but he noticed the way she set the empty bowl down, quietly, respectfully, as if unsure whether she had the right to make any noise at all. She stepped closer to the window, watching snow drift across the yard. He saw her reflection in the glass: tense shoulders, eyes sharpened by instinct, body angled toward the door even while standing still. "You can go outside if you want," he said. "Stay near the cabin. Snow's deep." She didn't respond. Her fingers tightened briefly on the window frame as she took a slow breath and stepped back. Later, he pulled on his coat to finish chores. She followed without needing to be asked. The cold hit her immediately, cutting through her cloak, but she steadied herself and walked behind him, keeping several feet of distance. He didn't turn around, but he shifted his pace slightly slower, making sure she could keep up. At the woodpile, Gideon swung the axe with controlled force. Each strike hit the block cleanly, sending pieces of pine falling into the snow. When the plank cracked louder than usual, she flinched. Her breath caught, and she stepped back quickly, shoulders raised. Gideon paused. He lowered the axe slowly and gave her a small nod. Not pity, just recognition. A way of saying he saw what the noise did to her. He continued splitting wood, keeping his movements steady, and even this time, letting the rhythm settle rather than startle. She watched him for a long moment before coming closer, close enough to gather the finished pieces and stack them neatly against the cabin wall. Her hands worked with quiet precision, each motion calm, deliberate. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But the shared task formed a small link between them, simple, wordless cooperation. When they returned inside, her posture was less rigid. She placed the cloak near the stove to dry. She sat at the edge of the bed without curling into herself. And when Gideon moved through the room, she no longer watched him with the same sharp suspicion, only guarded awareness. That evening, she sat near the stove, the warmth softening the tight lines in her face. Gideon brewed tea with dried leaves and set a cup beside her without expecting anything in return. She stared at the cup for several seconds before lifting it. He went back to sharpening his knife, each slow stroke echoing quietly in the room. Her eyes drifted to him, not in fear this time, but in calculation, trying to understand the man who had found her in the snow and expected nothing from her since. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But she no longer looked at the door like she needed to escape the moment he turned away. It was a small change, but it was the first. By the fourth morning, the storm had weakened enough for pale sunlight to press through the window, turning the frost on the glass into hazy streaks. The cabin held a steady warmth, but the cold outside still seeped in through the floorboards, reminding Gideon of the work he had to finish before the next snowfall. He rose from a chair he'd slept in, rubbing the stiff ache in his leg while shifting his weight carefully. The Apache woman, still silent, still watchful, sat near the stove, wrapped in the wool cloak. Her hair hung loose today, falling over her shoulders in dark, uneven strands. She had warmed her hands over the fire the same way she had the past 2 mornings, but something was different in her posture. Her back was straighter, her breathing steadier. Fear no longer sat in every inch of her frame the way it had when she first woke. Gideon opened the door to fetch firewood, and cold air rushed in. She flinched at the sudden draft, but didn't jump to her feet or grab for a weapon. Her reaction was smaller now, controlled. It was the first thing he noticed. When he returned with an armful of logs, he set them down beside the stove and saw her watching his leg. His limp had worsened overnight. Every step felt like dragging a chain through mud. He tried not to let it show, but she caught the tension in his face anyway. Her eyes flicked from his leg to his hands, then back again. She stood slowly, approaching him with cautious steps. She paused once, making sure he wasn't going to stop her, before kneeling beside him. She pointed at his thigh. Pain. Her voice was rough from disuse, low and controlled. Gideon hesitated, surprised she'd spoken. He gave a small nod. Old wound. She didn't ask anything else. Instead, she took a cloth from the basin, dipped it into warm water, wrung it out with trembling fingers, and placed it carefully against the injured muscle. Her touch was gentle, steady, focused. Not a healer's precision, just a survivor's instinct to help when she could. Gideon kept still, letting the warmth sink through his skin. The pain didn't disappear, but it eased enough for him to breathe deeper. You don't have to, he murmured. She didn't answer. She pressed the cloth again, firmer this time. Her expression didn't change. Not sympathy, not curiosity, just quiet determination. She worked until the shaking in her hands stopped, then set the cloth down and stepped back without a word. He watched her return to the stove, her movements slower, as if the small effort had taken something from her. But she didn't retreat into herself the way she had before. She sat facing him rather than turning toward the wall. Later, Gideon moved to fix the loose board near her bed. The plank had been rattling each time the wind hit the cabin just right, and he knew the sudden noise unsettled her. He fetched the hammer and nails, crouching near the bed while she sat close enough to see his hands. He swung the hammer in quieter, more controlled taps than usual, careful not to startle her. The wood creaked once, and her shoulders tensed instinctively, but she didn't move away. She watched his hands instead, tracking every motion as if memorizing the intent behind each one. When he finished, she tested the board with her palm. It no longer rattled. She gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement. Not gratitude. She wasn't ready for that, but trust that didn't need words. Gideon stood and returned the tools to the shelf. When he glanced back at her, he noticed her hair spread over her shoulders, the beads and the strands catching the firelight. She had taken time to redo them carefully, with deliberate precision. Beads arranged in a pattern that he didn't understand, but the act itself said something. A woman planning to leave wouldn't braid her hair like that. That evening, he cooked a simple meal, boiled potatoes, dried meat softened in broth. He placed her portion near the edge of the table. This time, she approached without waiting for him to step aside. She sat, eating slowly with controlled movements, her eyes flicking to him only once before focusing on her bowl. When she finished, she set the tin down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. A small sign of respect. Routine. Presence. Gideon sat across from her, elbows on the table, warming his hands around his own bowl. "You talk English," he said quietly. She hesitated, then nodded once. "You remember what happened before I found you?" Her jaw tightened. Her eyes lowered to the table. She shook her head, not in confusion, but refusal. She wasn't ready. He didn't push. He simply nodded and leaned back, letting the stove's warmth settle between them. Night came early. The cabin darkened except for the steady glow of the fire. She curled near the stove at first, shoulders tucked tight, blanket pulled to her chin. But as the hours passed, something changed. She shifted closer to the bed, then sat on its edge for a long moment, staring down at her own hands as if deciding whether she belonged there. Gideon stayed still, pretending not to notice. Eventually, she laid down on the bed again, not pressed against the wall the way she had before, but closer to the center, leaving space for him without fear that he'd take advantage of it. He took the chair, adjusting the blanket around her quietly. Her breathing slowed, deepened. She slept without gripping the blanket. Her face eased. Gideon watched the rise and fall of her chest, feeling something settle into place inside him. A quiet weight, steady and unexpected. For the first time since she arrived, the cabin felt less like a shelter built for one. It felt like a place where two people were learning how to breathe again, together. The snow had finally stopped falling by the time dawn crept across the yard. A thin layer of frost coated the fences, and a pale orange glow settled over the trees near the creek. Gideon Hale stepped outside with a bucket in one hand, moving slow as the cold dug into his leg. His breath came out in steady clouds as he walked toward the well, boots crunching through the frozen crust. Behind him, the cabin door opened a few inches. He didn't turn. He didn't want to scare her back into hiding. But he listened, hearing the faint shift of feet on wood, a quiet breath touched by hesitation. She stood there, wrapped in the wool cloak he'd given her, staring at the yard as though seeing it for the first time without panic. She stepped outside fully, closing the door behind her with a soft thud. Her movements were careful, but no longer frantic. She followed Gideon at a distance, one hand gripping the cloak to keep it close to her body. The cold stung her cheeks and reddened the tip of her nose, but she did not retreat. Gideon lowered the bucket into the well, his arms tightening as he pulled it back up. When he set the full bucket on the ground, he finally looked toward her. "You should stay close to the cabin," he said. "Snow's deep past the fence." She gave a small, control nod. Not an answer, but not rejection. Gideon grabbed the bucket and started back toward the cabin. After a long pause, she followed, stepping in his boot prints to make the walk easier. When her foot slipped on an icy patch, she steadied herself quickly, but he still slowed his pace, letting her keep up without rushing. Inside, the warmth hit them like a soft push of air. She moved immediately toward the stove, hands hovering over the heat. Gideon poured water into the kettle and set it above the fire. As he worked, she moved quietly around the cabin, her movements cautious but no longer frantic. She picked up the shirt he'd repaired the night before and ran her fingers along the stitching, then set it down neatly. "It's torn," she said, pointing to the shoulder seam on another shirt hanging by the wall. Gideon turned. Her voice was low, rough, but clearer than before. "It is," he replied. She hesitated only a second before lifting the shirt and gathering needle and thread from the small box on the table. She sat on the edge of the bed, legs tucked under the blanket, and began stitching with slow, practiced movements. Her hand still shook slightly from the cold, but her focus was sharp. Gideon watched her for a moment. She hadn't asked permission. She didn't treat the shirt like something she needed to return quickly. She just worked as if fixing it was her place now. When she finished the seam, she held the shirt up to check it, then set it carefully on the bed. Gideon opened his mouth to speak, but she was already reaching for the second tier. "You do good work," he said. She didn't look up, but her shoulders eased a fraction. "My mother taught." Gideon nodded, letting the silence settle. Her voice carried no pride or sadness, just simple fact. Something solid from her past she hadn't been forced to give up. By midday, the cabin smelled of broth simmering in the pot. She had started to help without being asked, cutting potatoes into even slices, placing them gently into the simmering water. When one piece slipped and fell onto the floor, she froze, eyes tightening as though expecting anger. Gideon knelt, picked it up, and tossed it aside without a word. Her breath eased. They ate at the table, side by side, instead of across from each other. She kept her eyes down, but she didn't hunch her shoulders like she used to. She finished her bowl, reached over, and placed it quietly near the basin. Later, when Gideon stepped outside to check the barn, she followed again, closer this time. The wind had softened, carrying the smell of melting snow. She stood beside him while he inspected the hinges on the barn door and didn't flinch when he hammered a loose nail back into place. When she noticed his limp worsen after a few steps, she slowed her pace to match his without drawing attention to it. Inside the barn, she watched him brush the mule's coat, her eyes following the slow rhythm of his hand. Then, without being asked, she picked up a small rake and cleared loose hay from the corner. She worked with steady movements, each motion deliberate, the way she might have cared for animals back home. Gideon felt something shift his chest as he watched her, something quiet, something he didn't name. Not pity, not obligation, something simpler, something like belonging. When they returned to the cabin, she placed his mended shirt on the table in front of him. "For you," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. Gideon ran his thumb along the stitching. "Thank you." She didn't smile, but her breath eased, her shoulders lowering slightly as if she had been waiting to hear whether she'd done something wrong. That night, she sat near the stove again, but this time she didn't stay at the far end of the bed. She shifted toward the center, leaving him room beside her. The fire cast warm light across her face, softening the tension that had lived there since he found her. Gideon pulled off his boots and sat on the bed, leaning back slowly. She lay down after a moment, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Her body was close, close enough that he felt the warmth of her through the quilt. She didn't curl away this time. She didn't keep her hands clenched. Her breathing remained steady. Gideon stared at the ceiling in the dim firelight, listening to her slow breaths beside him. He felt the quiet weight of her trust settling between them, small, fragile, but real. In the silence of that winter night, he understood one thing with certainty. She wasn't trying to escape anymore. She had chosen to stay. A heavy stillness settled over the cabin as night deepened, the kind that came after long hours of work and shared space. The fire in the stove burned low, casting a warm orange glow that reached only halfway across the room. Gideon Hale lay on his back beside the Apache woman, listening to her breathing. It had grown slower, steadier over the past week, no longer the sharp, shallow gasps of someone waiting for danger. He lay awake longer than he admitted to himself, watching the fire flicker through the cracks in the stove door and feeling the faint warmth of her presence near his shoulder. She wasn't pressed against him, but she was close enough that each slow rise of her chest brushed quietly through the air between them. At some point, he drifted off. Hours later, a sudden jolt shook the bed. Her breath tore from her chest in short, choking bursts. Her hands clenched around the blanket. Her legs kicked once as if trying to break free of something unseen. A soft whimper escaped her throat, stifled quickly, as if she was used to being punished for making noise. Gideon woke instantly. His heart jumped into a tight, controlled rhythm. He turned toward her, careful not to startle her further. Her eyes were open, but unfocused, staring at the cabin wall as though it were something else, something far worse. Her chest rose and fell with frantic speed. "Easy," Gideon whispered, keeping his voice low and steady. "You're here, not there." She didn't seem to hear him. A tremor ran through her hands, then her shoulders. Her jaw tightened until the muscles along her neck strained. Gideon didn't reach for her right away. He knew better than that. He let her see his hand first. Open, steady, resting between them. Her gaze snapped to it instantly, instinctively. Her whole body stiffened. "It's just me," he said. "Gideon." Her breathing hitched at the sound of his name. After a long moment, her hand twitched. Not toward him, just a reflex. But it told him she was coming back to the room piece by piece. He inched his hand closer, slow enough that she could stop him at any second. She didn't move away. Her chest kept rising and falling in rapid bursts. But her eyes were no longer locked in that frozen, distant stare. His fingers touched the back of her hand. She flinched, sharp but small. Then she stilled. "It's all right," Gideon murmured. "Just a nightmare." Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she looked down at their hands. She wasn't holding his, but she wasn't pulling away either. He let his fingers rest lightly over hers. No grip, no pressure, just quiet contact. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. Her jaw loosened. Her breath slowed. The trembling in her shoulders softened until her body no longer shook beneath the blanket. Gideon shifted slightly so she could lean against him if she wanted. Her eyes flicked to his chest, then to his shoulder, then back to their hands. Slowly, cautiously, she moved closer, resting her forehead against his upper arm. Not fully, just enough that she could feel his solid presence. Gideon kept still. Her breath brushed against his skin as she exhaled through her parted lips. Her fist remained clenched at first, but when she felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing, her fingers loosened gradually. She turned her hand under his, her palm meeting his palm, and left it there, small, warm, trembling, but willing. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The wind outside tapped against the window. Inside, her grip tightened, softly, not in fear but in search of something solid. Gideon wrapped his thumb gently around the side of her hand, anchoring her without holding her down. "You're safe," he said again. "Nothing here will hurt you." Her lips barely moved as she whispered. No noise, no shouting. "None," he replied. She exhaled slowly, as if releasing one more piece of the memory she had been trapped in. Her breathing steadied fully then, still deep but calm. She let her weight settle against him, her forehead resting against his shoulder. Her hair brushed the side of his neck, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the stove. Gideon waited until her breaths evened out before letting himself relax. He didn't pull his hand away. He kept it there, warm and steady, the same way you kept the lantern lit until morning. When she finally slipped back into sleep, she didn't flinch. She didn't curl away. Her body stayed close to his, trusting the nearness, trusting him. Gideon stared at the ceiling in the dim firelight, feeling the slow weight of her head against his arm. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of another person sleeping beside him, and he didn't move an inch until dawn. The weather warmed just enough to turn the snow into patches of damp earth, the kind that clung to boots and softened the ground around the fence line. Gideon Hale had been outside since early morning, repairing a sagging post with slow, deliberate movements. His leg ached from the cold, but he pressed through it the same way he always did, without complaint, without pause. Routine kept his mind steady. The Apache woman, still quiet, still watchful, stepped outside after a time, pulling the wool cloak around her shoulders. Her cheeks were pink from the mild wind, her braid falling over the front of her chest. She stood on the porch, watching him work. She had been doing that more often lately, just watching. Not with fear, not with suspicion, but with a kind of cautious steadiness. Gideon checked the tighten on the wire, leaned back, and wiped his hands on his pants. When he straightened, he saw her leave the porch and walk toward him. Her steps were slower in the mud, but she didn't stay back like she used to. She reached the fence, stood beside him, and rested her hand lightly on the top rail. No words, just presence. He was about to hand her a coil of wire when the sound of hooves broke the morning stillness. One horse at first, then the shape of a rider emerged from the pines on the ridge. A man moving with purpose, not wandering. The horse trotted down the slope toward the fence, the rider studying the land with sharp, calculating eyes. Gideon felt the shift immediately, an old instinct tightening the center of his chest. He moved slightly in front of her without thinking, placing his body between her and the approaching stranger. Her breath hitched, just once quick and sharp. Her hand gripped the fence rail tightly. Gideon didn't touch her, but he angled himself so she could take cover behind him if she needed. He kept his posture calm, but his muscles were wound-tight beneath his coat. The rider slowed near the property line, stopping a few yards away. His coat was dusty, his boots worn from long travel. His eyes scanned the yard with a cautious confidence Gideon didn't like. "Mornin'," the man called. "Looking for someone." Gideon didn't respond to the greeting. He rested one hand casually on the top rail, his fingers close enough to the rifle leaning nearby that reaching for it would take a single breath. "What do you want?" Gideon asked, voice even. The man adjusted his reins. "A girl. Young. Apache." His gaze flicked behind Gideon, searching. Gideon didn't move. "No one like that here." The man smirked slightly. "You sure? She ran from a camp south of here. Caused some trouble. Belongs to men looking to get her back." At that, Noya's breath caught so sharply Gideon heard it. Her fingers clamped around the fence rail. He felt her fear without turning around, as clear as snow crunching underfoot. He didn't give the man time to continue. "Move on," Gideon said, his voice low but firm. "Nothing for you here." The rider raised his brows, as if weighing whether to push further. "Strange thing. Folks say a quiet man lived out here alone for years. Now I see 2 sets of prints in the mud." Gideon's jaw tightened. "And now you'll see the back of your horse if you're smart." He reached for the rifle, not lifting it, but placing his hand on it openly, letting the message settle between them like a loaded trigger. The man studied him for a long moment. His eyes moved from Gideon's grip on the rifle to Gideon's steady stance. Leg injured or not, every inch of him was prepared to end this right now. Finally, the rider clicked his tongue and pulled on the reins. "Didn't mean trouble," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just a skin questions." "Ask him somewhere else," Gideon replied. The horse turned. The man didn't look back as he rode toward the ridge, disappearing behind the trees with the slow fade of hoofbeats. The moment the sound was gone, Noya's knees softened slightly. Not enough to fall, but enough that Gideon turned around to face her. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her fingers still curled hard around the fence. "Hey," he said gently. "It's over." Her eyes locked on his, fear, confusion, anger, all tangled together. She swallowed, tried to control her breath. Her shoulders remained tense, as though expecting another rider to appear any second. "He won't come back," Gideon said. She shook her head, not in disagreement, just in disbelief that anyone would stand for her the way he had. A long silence settled between them. Not the uneasy kind, a different kind, thick with the weight of what almost happened and the relief of what didn't. When she finally found her voice, it was quiet. "He knew me, I figured," Gideon said. "Doesn't matter now." Her lower lip trembled, but she steadied it. She stepped closer, stopping just inches from him. Her hand hovered near his coat, unsure whether she could touch him. He didn't move. He let her choose. After a long, shaky breath, she rested her fingertips against his sleeve. Light, barely there, but enough to show what she couldn't say yet. Thank you. I'm alive because of you. Gideon didn't lift his hand to touch her back, but he stood solid and still, letting her know she had nothing to fear behind him. They walked back toward the cabin together. She didn't trail several feet behind this time. She stayed right beside him, matching his slow, uneven steps. For the first time, she walked like someone who belonged on this land. And for the first time, Gideon let himself believe she might never leave. By the time the last of the heavy snow melted into dark patches of soil, the land around the cabin had begun to change. Thin blades of grass pushed through the thawing earth, and the air carried the damp smell of early spring. The creek flowed louder now, no longer trapped under ice. It was the first real sign that winter had loosened its grip. Gideon Hale stepped outside with a hoe in one hand and a sack of corn seeds in the other. His leg bothered him more when the ground was wet, so each step came slower than usual, but the warmer air took enough pain out of the injury that he could work without stopping every few minutes. He leaned on the hoe and surveyed the small patch of soil he'd used each spring for years, a space that fed only him because there had never been anyone else to feed. Not until now. The cabin door opened behind him. Noya stepped out, her hair neatly braided down her back, a small string of beads woven carefully into it. She wore the deerskin clothing he had found drying by the fire, and the wool cloak slung lightly over her shoulders. Her posture was different from the woman he'd found near the creek, upright, calm, aware rather than defensive. She walked toward him without waiting for him to call her. "You plant today?" she asked. "Yeah," Gideon replied. "Ground's thawed enough." She approached the patch of soil and knelt, testing the dirt with her fingers. A small smile, barely there, but real, crossed her face when she found it soft enough to dig into. She looked up at him once for silent permission. "You know how to do this?" Gideon asked. She nodded and held out her hand for the seeds. He handed her the sack. They worked side by side, saying nothing, each focused on a task that required no explanation. Gideon dragged the hoe slowly, forming long, even rows. Noya followed behind, leaning forward to place seeds into the small grooves he made. Her movements were steady, deliberate. She placed each kernel with care, smoothing the dirt over them with her palm before moving to the next. At one point, her cloak slipped off her shoulder. Gideon instinctively leaned forward to adjust it, but she caught the edge herself, pulling it back with a soft, controlled motion. When she glanced up at him afterward, her expression held no fear, just acknowledgement. A simple look, shared understanding. The sun rose higher, warming both of them. Gideon paused to rub the strain from his leg. Noya watched the motion, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "Pain again?" she asked. "Some," he admitted. She stepped closer and placed her hand lightly on his thigh, not holding him, not examining the wound, just grounding him. Her touch was gentle, her thumb brushing once against the fabric. "You work slower," she said softly. "I held more." Gideon didn't argue. He just nodded. For the first time since winter, he allowed someone else to carry the weight of a task beside him. By midday, the rows were finished. Mud clung to their boots, but neither seemed to notice. They stood back to look at their work, clean lines stretching across the small field, ready for the season. A faint breeze moved through the clearing, brushing Noya's braid against her shoulder. She looked at the field with a thoughtful expression, one he hadn't seen on her before. Something like hope, something like a future she wasn't afraid to imagine. "You did good," Gideon said, clearing his throat. "Couldn't be finished near as quick without you." She didn't smile, but her chin lifted slightly. She took the compliment and held it quietly, the way people do when they aren't used to receiving praise. They returned to the cabin to wash their hands. She poured warm water from the kettle while he dried the tools and stacked them neatly on the shelf. Inside, the room felt different, busier lived in. Her cloak hung beside his coat. Her repaired blankets lay folded on the corner of the bed. A second chair stood near the stove now, one Gideon had made out of scrap wood earlier in the week. When Noya saw the chair again, She traced her fingers along the smooth armrest. "You made this," she said. "Seemed right to have two." Gideon answered simply. She sat in it, testing the way it supported her back. She exhaled slowly. "Feels good." Her voice carried a softness he hadn't heard from her before. That evening, she prepared tea while he cut thin slices of dried meat. They ate together, sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed when one of them reached for the pot. She rested her hand on the table, and he placed his beside it, not touching, but close enough that their fingertips warmed in the same heat from the stove. After dinner, she leaned against him without hesitation. Her head settled against his shoulder, her braid sliding across his chest. He lifted his arms slowly, letting it fall gently around her back. She didn't stiffen. She didn't flinch. She allowed herself to rest against him fully, breathing slow and calm. They sat like that until the fire dimmed, their bodies relaxed in a way neither had felt in years. No words were needed, no promises spoken. The trust between them grew in that quiet moment, steady, real, and earned by every day they survived together. When they went to bed, she lay beside him without hesitation, her hand finding his beneath the blanket. Gideon tightened his fingers around hers, the faintest pressure, enough for her to know he meant it. They slept in shared warmth while the last cold winds of winter passed outside their cabin. Two survivors finally choosing a life that no longer felt temporary. The first true warmth of early summer settled over the land in a soft, steady way that made everything feel new. The creek ran fuller, carrying clear mountain water over smooth stones. Small green shoots pushed up along the edges of the garden rows. Birds returned to the tall pines, their calls drifting through the still air. For the first time since Gideon Hale had built the cabin years ago, the place didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home. Gideon stepped outside with a bucket of feed in one hand, his limp less sharp now that winter had passed. The morning sun warmed his back as he scattered feed for the chickens, each bird clucking and scratching through the dirt with quick movements. When he straightened, he caught sight of Noya stepping out of the cabin behind him. She wore her deerskin clothing with the beads she'd repaired over the past weeks, her long black braid falling over her shoulder. She looked stronger than she had when he found her, her face no longer hollow from fear and cold, her stance steady and grounded. Her eyes, once wary and sharp with survival instinct, now held a calm focus he had never expected to see this soon. She walked toward him across the yard, the morning light tracing the gentle movement of her steps. When she reached him, she set a hand on his chest, light at first, then steady, her palm warm against the worn fabric of his shirt. He rested his hand over hers. She didn't look away. "I stay," she said softly. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a choice spoken with full clarity. Gideon felt something settle inside him, heavy, certain, and peaceful. He nodded once, tightening his grip over her hand. "Then this is your home." Her breath shook slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of believing the words. She stepped closer, her forehead brushing his shoulder as her hand slid up to grip the side of his coat. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her gently against him. The two of them stood in the quiet yard for a long moment, letting the warmth of morning settle around them, letting the decision breathe. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered stood in front of them now. Later, they walked together to the small field they had planted during the spring thaw. The first green sprigs of corn rose from the soil in delicate lines. Noya knelt and touched one gently with her fingertips, her eyes softening the way they had when she first took care of them weeks ago. "These grow strong," she murmured. "They will," Gideon said. "We did it right." Her smile wasn't full or wide. It was small and steady, the kind of smile that formed only when a person felt safe enough to let it happen. She straightened and stood beside him, her arm brushing his. Inside the cabin, Gideon had made changes without mentioning them. Another shelf, a second pillow, a second cup on the table. She noticed everything. She touched each item as though confirming that it was real, that it belonged to her as much as to him. At dusk, she braided her hair by the stove, then held out the end of the braid toward him. "You tie," she said quietly. He took the thin strip of leather she handed him and tied the braid gently, his fingers brushing her neck. She leaned back slightly into the touch, but didn't rush away. When she turned to face him, her eyes held a question she had carried silently for days. He answered without speaking, resting his hand along her cheek, his thumb brushing the side of her face just once. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead to his. "Gideon," she whispered. It was the first time she said his name with warmth instead of fear. He cupped the back of her head with his hand, pulling her closer. The quiet between them was full, not empty, not tense, but steady, like something finally settling into place. She lifted her face and kissed him, slow, tentative but certain. Her fingers curled around the back of his shirt, as if anchoring herself to a choice she no longer doubted. He kissed her back with the same careful strength he used in every part of his life, steady, protective, never demanding more than she offered. When they parted, their breaths mingled, warm and close. No vows were spoken, no promises needed. That night, when they lay in bed, she pressed her head against his chest, her hand resting over his heart. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close without tightening his grip. Her breathing softened into a steady rhythm, easing in his sleep with full trust. Gideon stayed awake a little longer, feeling the gentle rise and fall of her breath against him. There was no fear in the room, no shadows waiting in the corners, just the slow promise of a life they were building. By morning, Noya braided his hair for the first time, sitting behind him, fingers working carefully, slow and gentle. When she finished, she rested her chin briefly on his shoulder, her arms lightly circling his waist. He placed a small carved wooden figure near her pillow, a wolf he'd whittled from scrap wood during the week, its edges smoothed and shaped with care. She picked it up, running her fingers over the tiny carved lines. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The way she held it spoke enough. They stepped outside together as the sun rose, hand in hand. Noya never looked toward the door again, and Gideon never walked the land alone.